Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to more 40k lore. Today we are going to be talking about the War in the Heavens. This is a necessary episode because the next one was supposed to be the Orcs, but I realized I needed to give some context to some of the stuff I was going to talk about, and so we have today's episode. Now, the War in the Heavens refers to a period of unknown length where the Old Ones fought against the Necrons and were rather rudely abrupted by a third race of less than entirely friendly participants. This period could be considered to be the founding mythos of the 41st millennium, as a lot of the races that are present in the 41st millennium have their origins somewhere in the War in the Heavens. I talked briefly about this in my Eldar lore video, but it is time we go into a little bit more detail. So, first off, let us talk about the Old Ones. The Old Ones are said to be the very first sentient life in the galaxy. They were supposedly a race of cold-blooded creatures. We know this only from vague descriptions. There's not that much is known of the Old Ones. However, they were said to be creatures of slow, cold-blooded wisdom, so we can assume that they were some form of reptilian life, probably. They were virtually immortal, essentially, and this allowed them to take a very, very lengthy period of time to consider, well, anything and everything, really, and they used these gifts to craft the webways. Essentially, they started pondering various questions, which led them to discovering alternate dimensions, and throughout the ages they learned how to manipulate these alternate dimensions to bend space. Essentially, they found a way to bend time and space, and thereby distance, in such a way that by stepping a single step through a portal, they could go from one planet to another, as if the two were right next to each other. And seeing as they had essentially mastered the art of instantaneous transportation, they naturally spread quite quickly across the galaxy, and some sources even claim that they spread themselves much, much further afield, although this is quite old lore, and a lot of this is a combination of very old lore and new lore. It is very hard to determine exactly what is the truth anymore, and I kind of feel like that might have been the point, to intentionally shroud this period of time in a bit of mystery, which personally I quite approve of. So, the Old Ones spread themselves across the galaxy, let us limit ourselves to that for the moment, spreading life in their wake. The Old Ones were of the opinions that all life was worth something, and all life could be utilized in some form in their grand design, and so they cultivated entire races like we might cultivate plants. They would sow the seeds of a new civilization, watch it grow up, for what appeared to them to be mere hours, but in reality millions of years passed by, and they would study them, they would scrutinize them and see what this particular life form could be used for. There is no record of them exterminating life, however, none whatsoever, so one has to assume that they either just let these civilizations all grow up and didn't really interfere with them at all, or there might have been some form of selection in the earliest stages, because they did create some rather violent races. Although in their defense, these races were created through necessity rather than just a, longing to see things blow up. And this is where the first contradiction starts rearing its head. You see, that the Old Ones were not alone. They were not the only creatures roaming across the galaxy, but they were probably the only ones who were aware of themselves. There was also a race of energy creatures of massive proportions, being able to span, in some cases, entire solar systems. These gaseous clouds weren't really intelligent as we would think of them, but they had a certain instinct and a certain hunger, they would envelop stars and devour them over the course of centuries, even millennia, leaving behind virtually nothing. They would just devour entire star systems. But they didn't do this out of malice, at least not initially. They did this because they were hungry and they didn't really know any way of gaining sustenance other than via this. And these creatures is the first contradiction. You see, in the older lore, it would appear that the Old Ones found these creatures to be somewhat unpalatable and tried to destroy them, and some say even more or less succeeded, which is contrary to the newer lore that says that the Old Ones never tried to destroy anything, but that these massive energy creatures that were later to be known as the Catharns initiated the war for their own more or less unknown reasons, although their reasons later on became horrifyingly apparent. So this is the first contradiction. One says that the Catharns started the war, the other says that the Old Ones started the war, and it is kind of hard to determine which one is correct. So bear that in mind while I continue onwards with the story. So, having talked a little bit about the Old Ones, let's now talk about the Catharns. So, as I mentioned, they were these giant energy creatures that survived by simply just sucking the energy from entire stars, which is a rather considerable undertaking, as I'm pretty sure you will agree. However, there was a race called the Necrontyr. This race noticed this creature feeding off their own sun, and somehow found a way of communicating with this creature, and they were the ones who dubbed them Catharns, which in their language meant star gods or star vampires, depending on your translation. Regardless of which interpretation you choose, the fact remained that the Necrontyr had managed to do something no one else had so far managed. They had managed to communicate with these creatures. As to the circumstances, this also varies on which interpretation of the lore you subscribe to. In one case, this was the last surviving Catharn that had essentially sought refuge within the Necrontyr star system, and that is why the Necrontyr later managed to convince it to do what it did. The other idea is that this might have been one of many such creatures that had been convinced by the Necrontyr to take on another existence, which I'll get to quite shortly, and this was then eventually what started the war with the Old Ones. So, the Necrontyr of course realized that, having their sun eaten would probably be somewhat detrimental to them staying on their home planet, and they wished to convince the Catharn to go eat something else, but, well, the Catharn was not easily convinced by being talked to by a bunch of ants, so they figured they needed something more direct. They somehow managed to convince this star god to inhabit a shell of living metal, not that much larger than a man. Essentially, this massive creature of pure energy was all concentrated within what could perhaps best be described as a casket, as a statue, perhaps. All of this godlike power contained within a container not that much larger than a man, but infinitely more powerful. This allowed the Catharns to harness their own energy, so to say. They didn't continuously bleed the energy out into the ether, and as such, they had nowhere near the same need to devour energy. And this also became a slight problem. You see, the Catharns, although not needing to eat entire stars anymore, were still rather peckish. The problem with this was that they had developed a taste for something quite different than star energy. They had begun to feed on fear, on bodies, on meat. Not so much the meat itself, as much as the emotions emanating from it, the fear of it, the terror. This was what they primarily fed on, but they gained these things by, well, torturing and tormenting their victims in the most horrifying ways imaginable. And I mean, hell, go on Google for like 5 minutes and Google torture devices, and you'll see just how ingenious we humans have been over the last few thousand years. Imagine what a being of infinite power, millions of years old, could come up with. This, however, did not sit at all well with the Old Ones. They were of the opinion that all life was sacred, or at the very least useful, and the Catharns were convinced that all life was food and should be tormented as much as humanly possible, or, well, as much as godly possible, before then being slowly devoured. So you can imagine some friction between the two factions, and this eventually ended up in all-out war. Now, you might think that this would have been a pretty damn short war. The Old Ones controlled, well, everything, and the Catharns controlled a dozen planets or so, inhabited by the Necron tier. How much of a challenge could that possibly be? Until, of course, you realize that, no matter the numbers, this is still a war between a, if virtually immortal and extremely long-lived race, versus a god. So, yeah, it dragged on for a bit, and the Old Ones became increasingly desperate to defeat the Catharns, and came up with all manners of inventive ways of doing this, everything from ludicrously devastating weapons to entire races developed specifically to defeat the Necron tier and their Catharn overlords. Now, this should give you some perspective. The Old Ones were willing to plant the seeds of life, and then guide it subtly over the course of thousands, if not millions of years, into being the kind of weapons that they could employ against the Necron tier. So, this war must have lasted for millions of years. In fact, we do know that the Old Ones came about roughly 60 million years before the current date of Warhammer 40k, the 41st millennium, so this war must have lasted for an absolutely ludicrous amount of time and could have encompassed the entire universe for all we know. The races they created included the Eldar and the Orcs, and there are some tantalizing evidence and some hints throughout the lore that would suggest, and this would further lend credence to the idea that the Old Ones covered the entire universe, not just the galaxy, that they also created the Tyranids. Now, this one is primarily based on a part in the Horus Heresy books. I'm going to endeavour not to spoil anything here, but essentially a beacon, a structure constructed by the Old Ones, had been discovered by loyalists, and they were using it for their own purposes during the heresy. However, due to unforeseen circumstances, the beacon was overloaded, shall we say. It was run far beyond its tolerances, and this created a bright but short-lived flash in, well, the Immaterium, essentially. And it was this very flash that drew the Tyranids towards the Milky Way galaxy. Now, there is of course always the argument to be made that this was simply a coincidence. The Tyranids were from somewhere else, but they are of course capable of reading the ebbs and flows, I should say, the tides of the Immaterium, and so when they noticed this explosion, they simply turned towards it and wandered on their merry way in search of prey, because, well, the light probably indicated prey, yes, so that is one explanation. The other is hinted at in the text itself. It says that the Tyranids were looking for this sign. This was exactly what they were looking for, in other words. Which seems a little bit odd, because the choice of words seems to suggest that they were looking for this thing specifically. They had some way of knowing this light from other lights, and they knew what it meant. It meant, come here. And it wouldn't be beyond the realms of possibilities that the Old Ones would have created just such a race. I mean, think about it. The Tyranids are designed specifically to evolve to defeat their opponents. They are a race designed to attack the enemy, be beaten back, adapt themselves, and attack again, however many times is required to eventually overwhelm their enemy. And if you were fighting something that could not be easily quantified, for example, oh, I don't know, Star God, that might be exactly the weapon that you might need. Just a thought. It is an idea that I myself am very fond of, because it sounds awesome, really. So you're free to make up your own mind on that one, certainly, but it's certainly a very cool little aspect of 40k lore, isn't it? The fact that lore has grown to such a massive degree now that we can continuously see these little hints, we can draw a conclusion from them, we can make assumptions, and even fairly good theories. It's really quite lovely. It's one of the main reasons why I absolutely adore 40k, but gushing aside, the Old Ones eventually won this war, or at least so goes one interpretation of the lore. In this interpretation, the Necrontyr were essentially forced out of their living metal bodies and scattered across the galaxy, forced to hide, forced to go dormant. They essentially hid themselves from the Old Ones so as not to be exterminated. This is the version of the lore where it would appear that there were several Catharns, several of these energy creatures, that essentially went into a kind of hibernation, figuring that, well, we are gods. The Old Ones are not, so if we sleep for long enough, odds are, 1, they won't be able to find us, and 2, we will eventually be able to wake up in a galaxy, or a universe even, without the Old Ones. The other interpretation goes that the Catharns were all focused into one single individual that was eventually betrayed by the Necrontyr as they... well, it became pretty apparent which way the wind was blowing, and so they rebelled against their Catharn overlords, and somehow managed to defeat them, shattering their living form, their casket, and binding what remained of their power into shards, which they even now use in battle. And then there is a third interpretation that combines all of these, strangely enough. You see, the third interpretation was that the Catharns were losing, and that the Necrontyr were rebelling, and probably managed to do something to them, like shattering them, or sending them into exile, sending them into their deep slumber and hibernation. But the Old Ones were not the victors for long. You see, this conflict that had been raging possibly for millions of years had, of course, created a rather considerable stir in the Immaterium. As you should all be aware of by this point, the Immaterium, the warp, is a reflection of our world. It is all of the feelings, all of the immaterial things that happen in our world have a reflection on the warp. Feelings like fear, anger, hatred, disgust, all of these things, love, passion, everything, quite literally, has an effect on the warp. And so you can imagine that a war that spans millions of years and costs untold billions upon billions upon billions upon billions upon billions of lives would have a rather significant impact upon this thing. Interestingly enough, some sources seem to claim that before this the warp was essentially inert, and this explains also why the Old Ones were capable of bending it to their will so easily to create webway portals, and how they were able to use, well, what appears to be, at least, warp powers mentioned in the lore without any risk of angering the Chaos Gods. Essentially, this idea seems to state that Chaos, and the Immaterium itself as a living entity, quote-unquote living, only occurred during the war in the heavens. And it is the result of this, whether or not the warp was a still ocean before and then was turned into a raging maelstrom by the conflict, or if it was always this raging maelstrom and simply now finally started to seep out into the material world, is really not that important. What happened, however, is very, very important indeed, because, you see, the war in the heavens was finally ended quite decisively, not by the Old Ones, and not by the Catharns or the Necrontyr, but by the appearance of what we only know today as the Enslavers. The Enslavers are essentially demons, although they are the earliest forms of demons. They are not demons as in Khornate demons, Nurgle demons, the Neshi demons. They are more a specific manifestation of the warp in its more predatory aspects. Now, again, we have to go back to the two ideas of fluff. Either the warp was a peaceful lake, or already a stormy place, but without the ability to go over into our world. The official fluff for the Enslavers themselves state that they were essentially created by the various races made by the Old Ones. These races all had their own experiences, their own emotions, their own fears, hopes, dreams, etc., and all of these new races being created so quickly by the Old Ones to counter the Catharns was what eventually sent the warp into turmoil and created the Enslavers. Now, again, I said these were demons, but that is not entirely correct. As with so many things in the 41st millennium, there are subtleties in all of these things. You see, a demon is a pure warp entity that requires the power of the warp in the material universe to stay in our world, or they require a willing host. The Enslavers needed neither of these. They were material creatures, yet they were certainly warp creatures as well. They have massive psychic abilities. This is why they're called Enslavers. They are capable of enslaving entire planets worth of people with merely a handful of Enslavers. And as if this was not bad enough, they are also capable of a rather grisly feat. You see, the Enslavers can not only enslave people via psychic powers, they can also implant their own larvae into, well, pretty much anything living. The larva then takes control over the host via burrowing into its brain and manipulating it directly via electrical and chemical responses delivered straight into the victim's brain. Over time, the enslaver's larva will slowly but surely start to devour its host, while the host is alive, mind you. And eventually, once it's taken full control over the host body, warp itself into another enslaver. This, as you can imagine, is quite unfortunate, as you now have a massive race of extremely powerful psyches capable of enslaving thousands upon thousands, if not hundreds and millions of people, with very little effort, and they're also capable of reproducing at nightmarish speeds. Essentially, for every single person they enslave, they have the potential to create another enslaver. If they enslave a world of 1 million people, well, in a couple of years you're going to have 1 million enslavers to deal with. And that is exactly what happened. The enslavers appeared in epidemic numbers. They covered the galaxy, quite literally, and began taking over, well, everything, quite simply. This eventually ended the war between the Old Ones and the Catharns simply by scouring the galaxy of all life, which is a fairly effective way of ending a conflict, certainly. Some races managed to survive either by not being noticed, simple as that, by hiding, by retreating into the webways, etc., or simply by being too stupid and stubborn to die, the orc being amongst the latter options. And eventually, the enslavers passed away from the mortal world. It is unclear whether they returned to the warp, whether they simply died out once they had, well, pretty much eaten everything there was and virtually starved to death. The enslavers were not big on agriculture, let's just say. They had no way of actually nurturing the planets that they had cleansed of life, and they also had no real interest in, burning or eating the planet, so they would simply just scour it of all intelligent life, and then move on like a plague. So, it is unclear. They might have returned to the warp, they might simply have starved to death when they couldn't find anything to nom on, or perhaps they're still out there somewhere in the universe, billions upon billions of them still spreading outwards, eating innumerable galaxies. Perhaps not the cheeriest of notions, I will agree, but nevertheless a possibility. And this is where we run into a little bit of a stumbling stones, because according to the lore, the Enslavers essentially ate everything that the other races hadn't finished off. The Necron tier went into hiding, along with their ex-overlords, the Catharns. The Old Ones were supposedly wiped out, but recent hints in the Horus Heresy book series seems to suggest that the Old Ones might still be around, if much diminished. And of course the Eldar survived simply by hiding out in their webway portals until the worst of the storm passed, so it is unclear whether the Old Ones are still a thing, whether they have been wiped out, or whether they are merely hiding, like the Catharns, and if they might one day return. Perhaps, indeed, that just like the Tyranids, the Old Ones also saw the flash of the beacon, and might even now be on their way back to the 41st millennium. Who knows? Who knows? But, before finishing up, I do have to mention a few extra things about the Enslavers. I'll get back to the Catharns in the Necron lore video, but for now, the Enslavers are still around, although not in the numbers that they used to be, and they do not seem to have the same guiding purpose as they did in the old days. They no longer seem to seek out worlds to devour. Rather, they appear to be almost kind of a natural disaster kind of threat. They travel through unknown means, through the warp, without quite being in the warp, and they are capable of seeking out living creatures via the vibrations they make in the warp. The descriptions in the lore are somewhat vague and almost make them sound like some kind of gigantic spidery organism capable of feeling minute pulls on its webs scattered out through the galaxy, but they are still a thing, although, like I said, they don't seem to have their own old guiding instinct of just eating everything. Instead, they kind of show up at random on worlds they find interesting and set about doing, well, very, very horrible things to the local populace. And they are also much less powerful than the Enslavers we heard of old. Now, this might also be down to the simple fact that back in the day, there was a hell of a lot more of them than there are now. In these days, it is extremely unusual for more than perhaps half a dozen or so enslavers to appear in any one location at the same time, and usually far less, but they are still a considerable danger within the Imperium, as if they are not discovered and rooted out quite quickly, then the potential consequences can be dire indeed, as one enslaver by itself, weakened as it is from its old counterpart at the very least, can maybe only mind control a dozen or so people, and then implant them with their larva. In a few years, there will be a dozen enslavers, each enslaving another dozen people, and so on, and so on, and so on. So you can imagine that you don't want these creatures to be hanging around for too long, and at the same time, it's damn hard to find something this small until it's practically too late. I mean, the Inquisition can't be everywhere, and reports of 12 missing people on a planet of billions is hardly going to catch their eye. A few thousand missing people, perhaps a few million missing people, and it might be too late, you know? It is a delicate balance, certainly. Another oddity was that the old enslavers were described essentially as a scourge, just washing over the galaxy, enslaving and then slowly but surely devouring everything in their way. These new enslavers seem to have different goals, more long-term goals. They are capable of rational decisions, which is why they will not enslave 12 people, then devour them, then enslave another 12 people, and then numb them. They will instead bide their time, growing their numbers, and only eating what is necessary to survive. This by itself indicates that they have some form of long-term goal, but they also force their enslaved population to work for them, to build things, build weapons, build armored vehicles, build granaries, create food for themselves. They create themselves an army, and once this is done, they spread outwards, trying to conquer other systems to give themselves more to feed on, obviously, and also to create more enslavers. This seems to be a rather different modus operandi from their previous actions, but perhaps this is simply a rational decision made on their part, because we have been unable to determine whether or not they are intelligent by human standards. Even though they are clearly capable of making rational decisions, that might not mean that they are, that they have their own goals, their own motivations. They might simply just be driven by an instinctual need to just destroy everything. That is entirely possible, that they are a warp-born manifestation specifically created from destruction, from the war in the heavens, and so all they really want to do is, well, destroy everything. And since they can't rely on numbers anymore to simply just enslave entire planets and then devour them, they have to do it slowly, with more traditional means. At least, that is my theory. So, with that, I hope that you've gotten a bit more of a grasp on the terms of the War in the Heaven and the old ones, because I'm going to be using a few of these throughout the Orc video when I'm referring to the Ordered ones as their creators and their role in the War in the Heavens. So, until then, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you soon. Have a good day.